This is the On Humans podcast with your host, Ilari Mäkelä. And here's the first full episode of 2025, this one on the origins of patriarchy. Now, whatever you think of the discussions around modern day patriarchy, I think no one can deny that history books are full of it. But why? Why is it so persuasive? Now, one kind of casual theory that comes to many people's minds is that, well, it's just human biology. I mean, men tend to be bigger and stronger. And just look at chimpanzees, you might say. You know, there's a couple of problems with that explanation. One is that it's true that female chimps don't have much power in their groups, but female bonobos do. So there doesn't seem to be anything biologically impossible about that. And more importantly, not all human societies are patriarchal, at least not near it to the extent that we are so familiar with. And we don't need to look at modern Scandinavia to get inspiration for this. I mean, quite contrary, my guest today believes that equality between the sexes might have been the norm throughout most of the human story. Now, this might sound surprising given the rates of patriarchy across time and space. However, it is supported by a simple finding, which is that at least some level of gender equality is pretty common amongst existing hunter-gatherers, something that stands in stark contrast to their agricultural neighbours. This is something that has been discussed in the hunter-gatherer literature for a long time, but there was a new paper that came out of it in 2024 where the researchers found very remarkable levels of equality in leisure time between husbands and wives in hunter-gatherer households. And the levels of equality surprised the scholars themselves, but it did support the relatively rosy view that many have held about hunter-gatherer equality. So what does all this tell us? Why would living from wild foods lead societies to be more equal between the sexes? Or vice versa, why would starting to farm nudge you towards having more male power? And what should we make of the many outliers to this pattern, from matriarchal farmers in northeastern India to the very, very strong preference for boys that some Arctic hunter-gatherers have? To discuss these topics, I invited the lead author of the paper I mentioned to the show. Angarika is a cognitive anthropologist at the Central European University. And despite being in very early stage of her career, she's produced a ton of interesting articles on gender inequality from around the world. And so this was a very wide-ranging conversation. I hope that you enjoyed it. If you do and want to dig a little bit deeper, there are many useful links in the show notes. You'll find various articles discussed in the show and also a written summary of the highlights from this 1 hour long episode. Now, if you do indeed enjoy the conversation and you are new to the show, then do subscribe to On Humans to get more material, which makes new research in humanities and human sciences more understandable to everyone and more meaningful to the big questions around our self-understanding. If you're a returning listener and you want to give a little bit of extra boost and support to the show, you can leave a 5-star review on Spotify or Apple Podcasts or whatever app you're using. And of course, you can head to patreon.com/onhumans, where you can join a wonderful group of people who are supporting me with a small amount every month. Thank you to everyone who is already doing that. But whoever you are, wherever you are, you're commuting, running errands, doing exercise, or just wanting to learn more about our peculiar species, thanks for tuning in. And I bring to you Angarika Deb. Hi Deb, welcome to On Humans.
Hello, thank you for having me here.
Start by talking about hunter-gatherers and gender equality on a high level before we talk about your recent work on a specific aspect of it. So you've written an article for the Encyclopedia of Sexual Psychology and Behavior about hunter-gatherers. So if someone comes to you and is like, well, give me the pitch, give me the 1 minute, 2 minute story, what should anyone know about hunter-gatherers and gender equality? What would you say?
The 2 minutes pitch would be the finding from across different sorts of hunter-gatherers that men and women in hunter-gatherer societies have very similar status, positions of power, status, involvement in the economy and political lives, and they're in general super egalitarian. That's the short pitch. It was really interesting for me when I started doing all of this research because I knew specifically about a couple of hunter-gatherer societies, but then you see all of these similarities. And I think it's really inspirational to have these insights from these societies in contemporary society, because it just goes on to show how ancestrally we've been very gender equal. We have grown to be gender unequal, but perhaps there's a way out of gender inequality when we look at how we live, how humans live.
Yeah, and I guess the logic there being that hunting and gathering is the original economy. And so if that's associated with gender equality, well, then that's probably what was going on for a long time in the human story. Sometimes when making these kind of claims about what modern day hunter-gatherers do and therefore what our ancestors do, the pushback is, yeah, but hold on a second, these people are also in history, they are not living fossils, they have also changed, etc. And I think that our argument, of course, needs to be taken seriously. At the same time, it is funny if you find all these groups around the world doing surprisingly similar things without contact with each other. There's probably something going on. Is that why you think that we're making a legitimate jump to the past, or what do you think of the general concern of not treating hunter-gatherers as living fossils?
Yeah, I mean, there is definitely some value to the criticism because current day hunter-gatherers just don't have the same environments as previous hunter-gatherers did, just because of the presence of towns and villages around them. And a lot of hunter-gatherers are not pure hunter-gatherers anymore. A lot of them are actually taking part in agriculture, they're trading their hunted and gathered stuff with neighboring people. So they are not pure hunter-gatherers in that sense. But also, yes, like you point out, there is remarkable similarities. If you keep the group of the size the same, and if you keep the subsistence mode to be the same, there's remarkable similarities in the way people behave in these societies across different continents. And also, this is basically behaviorally, there's not a lot better that we can do than this. This is our best approximation. We have to agree that it's an approximation, but it is the best one that we have at the moment.
The one thing I also find a bit uncompelling is, in a possible reply in this context, is that sure, there must have been things that have been adopted from agricultural neighbors, but given that the neighbors tend to have significantly bigger gender inequalities, it would be a bit weird for me to hear that the arrow goes that way.
So, if you've followed the work of Patricia Draper, who has been looking at the Kung Bushmen for, I think, over 30 years, she started as a PhD student looking at them. And then, like one of the few anthropologists, she kept going back to the site for over 30 years, well into her retirement. And she actually saw that the individuals, the specific individuals of the groups, of that specific group, who started doing a bit more agriculture and started accumulating property, also started taking over gender unequal norms from the neighboring villages.
Very impressive piece of evidence, and I did not know that. Another interesting piece of data, by the way, I don't know what you think about this, but another thing that convinces me that the gender equality that we observe in modern day hunter-gatherers is probably evidence of something that has a very, very long history, is that actually genetically, we don't know what happened, but something really important happened genetically after the origins of agriculture. You can see that there is this thing called the Y chromosome bottleneck, which is a little bit, I mean, let's hope we don't lose listeners in the weeds here. We don't need to go into the genetic details of it, but you basically see that somehow a small group of men start having significantly more power in terms of their reproductive success. And what exactly this means, we don't know, but we know something happens. We have very hard evidence that something interesting happens in the past, whatever, 5,000 years or so. And that to me also suggests that that agriculture did, at least after some time, agriculture did bring it some kind of dramatic change in the way that men and women interacted, which would, again, it doesn't prove anything, but it does suggest that, well, there was a time before and there was a time after.
Yeah, I mean, this from the one paper that I've read on this was actually the important evolutionary thing that happened was the change in subsistence and the change in lineage systems. So in agricultural societies, once women started moving towards the male side of the family, the paternal gene is getting passed down along a line, and it's concentrated spatially within the same area. So that's also called unilineal descent. It could be for the maternal side or the paternal side, but basically you can trace back the genetic resemblance of all individuals living in the same group through one side of the lineage system.
Which you see within surnames around the world.
Oh, yes.
I mean, not just in Western surnames, but in Chinese, for example, of course, it's really important. It is the dad's surname that it passes along the line. So when you hear Chinese people say, oh, this person is a direct descendant of Confucius because they are called Kong something. And it's like, well, yeah, everyone in China is a direct descendant of Confucius by this time. When you do the math, everybody is. But it is if they're in a linear line. But you know, the thought there is just that the hunter-gatherers that we know of, they don't typically do patrilinear descent or movement.
No.
So it's not an expectation that women must move to the husband.
Yeah, it's a very practical decision most of the times. It's not a rule-based decision. It's a very practical decision that every couple makes for themselves. And because of that, there's a lot of studies, for instance, in the Amazonia, which directly compares the genetic relatedness of groups which are forager and which are agricultural and pastoralist. And the agricultural and pastoralist societies have a much higher genetic relatedness to each other, groups that are staying in one place, compared to foragers who are not super genetically related to each other.
That's such an important point, because it's so easy to have this image of hunter-gatherers as living in these small communities where they never interact with someone who's not their family member, and actually it's the opposite. It's because they won't always move to the male line. They don't have these clans of male descent sticking to, but as you say, they actually have higher genetic diversity. And I mentioned the San Kalahari Bushman, the Kung, the Jiuhuansi, known by many names. I'm pretty sure that they actually have the highest genetic diversity in the world of any group.
Oh, really?
Yeah, and it has to do partially with the fact that they're kind of direct descendants of the what you might call the source population of all modern humans.
Oh, right. I see.
But anyway, it's still they're able to maintain that really high genetic diversity.
I think there's like a few factors that actually contribute, which are kind of important. One is this linear system, which does not exist. I mean, it's called virilocality. So the fact that men and women can move anywhere. So they're moving between camps. Also, they're nomadic. And when they're nomadic, it's not necessary that the whole camp moves. Sometimes one family can move, a couple of families can move. That in turn is tied to the fact that they don't have material possessions, and they don't have a lot of immovable property, so they can actually move. And they do end up moving. One family can decide that we want to go and reside with somebody else. And all of this is actually helped by their cultural norms of food sharing, which are not, relatedness based. You don't only share with people who are genetically related with you. There is reciprocity based sharing for sure. And there are clusters that form when people share food. But in general, the idea is that people share food on a more or less egalitarian basis. So all of these things, I think, together help with actually creating and stabilizing this genetic diversity.
By the way, when talking about this, I can't resist making one one observation, which is it's funny how these nomadic hunter-gatherers are in some sense such an opposite of modern industrialized big cities with all their no wealth accumulation, constant food sharing. But then on some things, they are also much more similar to 21st century dating scene in a big city than they are to a traditional farming village. Because of course, if I think of how my friends are marrying, mating, etc., it is very much like you say, people, they can move to the wives, to the husband side or whatever, and so it is funny how some of these things suddenly start resembling them more in certain modern contexts.
I mean, also the globalization, people are now free to, and then they have sort of developed some sort of norms which allow them to move to a new country and, not be kicked out by them, but sort of be integrated into their societies. And then they can meet there. They have their children there, they settle down. Yeah, that's true, actually. That's really cool, no?
No, it is. On that point, by the way, do you know anything about norms around, for example, homosexuality in hunter-gatherer groups? I mean, because the general impression we get from this is that they are more relaxed about about these kinds of things in general. But do you know anything about how relaxed they are around things like homosexuality?
I actually don't. I don't. Yeah. I was reading Barbara Smuts' paper on the origins of patriarchy, and there she has a couple of long sections on female alliances and how female would form social networks just to neutralize male dominance. Males who can physically dominate women, the way women neutralize that is by forming bonds. And she does mention that when they form those bonds, there's intimacy in terms of talking and stuff, but there's also sexual intimacy sometimes. That's about all I know, I think.
We should ask some of the anthropologists you work with who have spent a fair amount of time living with hunters, like Nikhil Chowdhury, for example, a past guest, and I know you're a collaborator.
That's true. We should ask him.
But hey, I think at this point maybe it's a good transition towards your recent paper, because of course it's important to notice general trends like hunter-gatherers tend to be gender egalitarian, but immediately, of course, one of the pushbacks will be like, well, that must be too simplified. That's too rosy of a picture. I'm sure that there are some kind of gender differences, and you've taken that very seriously, and you actually have a study where you actually went to look for certain dynamics that are relatively similar to what we're familiar with, and you didn't find it.
Yeah, so we started this project so I was looking at a lot of sociological findings on household division of labor, finding that there's a lot of inequality, and despite differences across countries and how gender equal they are, differences on the gender equality index scale, there was still very unequal when it came to household division of labor. Females are still doing a lot more. And then we were modeling households as this bargaining problem, theoretically, where there's a joint goal that both partners have, which is they want to keep running the household smoothly. And if there's children involved, they want to raise the children in the best manner possible. But they're also private individuals, so they have their own interests to look after. So it's basically this push and pull of going on between how to get the best out of my partner and the household for supporting my own interests while making sure that the household actually keeps functioning. And basically, it was a bit of a luck thing because I was already working with Nikhil Chaudhary, who had data on how men and women are distributing their time. Men and women from each household are distributing their time. And also, we had all of this data from industrialized societies.
So Nikhil had data from hunter-gatherers about how they distribute their time.
Yes.
And you had data from industrial societies. Okay, yeah.
Yes, yeah, indeed. So we wanted to do a comparative study, and we wanted to see if this bargaining model is actually relevant or not, or is it a very culture-specific model which can only explain data from industrialized societies.
And the bargaining model would suggest that if the husband, for example, has more outside options, it's easier for them to leave the relationship they have, easier for them to support themselves with a job that they have, a bigger social network, whatever. Then they are able to bargain a better deal when it comes to who does the dishes.
Yes, exactly. For themselves. Like they have a higher threat point. We call it a lot of things. Outside options, disagreement points, threat points.
Before going to the hunter-gatherers, just very briefly on the industrial societies, what exactly does give men the bigger bargaining power that allows them to do less dishes according to the models that you've worked with?
So we were looking, in the industrialized societies, the most important predictors are economic resources, which will include what job prospects they have, how much savings they have, but also other mating prospects. That's always a factor.
Okay, so I'm sure that there are many caveats, but generally speaking, you find some predictive power to this kind of economic game theoretic model. And I guess that this is really easy to see in a traditional housewife scenario is that I have many friends whose parents had this kind of traditional split. And many of their moms might say that they loved the fact that they were able to. I know one particularly well who said that she loved the fact that she was able to stay home with kids. She didn't like work. She was really happy about it. But the one thing that really sucked was that then she doesn't have any, in a sense, bargaining power because she cannot leave, because she doesn't have money to leave. And I think that's where pattern you're describing is really strong.
Yeah. Also, it's important to point out that it's not always explicit bargaining, but there's the psychology of power is very implicit as well. What's the sort of status they have in their couple, and how much voice they have over decisions as well. So it's not always explicitly saying, look, I have so many friends, or look, I can actually get another wife if you don't agree to do what I ask you to do. It's also very implicit. I would say a lot of it is.
That makes sense. That makes perfect sense. Yeah, good addition. But taking that general pattern, you took that into the hunter-gatherer context then. And
Yes.
the assumption there would be that if the same pattern holds with hunter-gatherers, what you would expect is that in the couple, the person who has better social networks, social capital, better support networks, they would then use that as a kind of leverage to well, contribute less. So you got data, you built a model, and what happened?
And we could not. So we had predictions from the model, which were absolutely not substantiated by the data. The regression line was essentially a flat line. The data points were everywhere. And then we looked at how, so then we built another model, which was actually looking at how the leisure hours are split between men and women. And we saw that there's a very equal split of leisure time in both the Akta and the Bayaka across all households.
So there were two. I don't know if we didn't mention this earlier. So the data came from one hunter-gatherer group in the Republic of Congo, the Bayaka, right, and then one from the Philippines, the Acton.
Yes.
Yeah, and yeah. So the long story short then is that they are indeed gender egalitarian even more than you were perhaps assuming.
Yeah.
What is, I think, what's really interesting and why I found the paper to be so interesting is that you use this leisure time as the kind of measure of gender inequality, because I could really easily imagine someone who says, well, yeah, obviously the hunter-gatherers look kind of equal to us because they don't have money, they don't have wealth. And so we can kind of see the fact that there are like underlying inequalities. And I think that that was a really nice way of studying something which they really do have and probably value, which is leisure time.
There is gender differences for sure. Like they would do certain different tasks from each other. They would have different preferences for tasks from each other, but leisure is something that every person needs and wants. So that's like the common currency between men and women shared.
And that, by the way, is an important point for me. As you might know, I've covered the debates a little bit recently around the question of how much do hunter-gatherers actually split time between men and women, so that men hunt, women gather, versus everybody does everything. And the one thing that, I mean, if I had a take-home message from it, it was that, well, it's not as strict of a division as folks like me might have thought, but there does seem to be a trend across the world that men do more of the hunting, women do more of the gathering. But hey, that's not a problem for gender equality. If you wanna, if you're interested in a gender equality, I think the real message was that it doesn't matter that they do different things because they can still meet each other as equals. And I was kind of self-questioning myself of why do I find this to be kind of like an inspirational message? Is it because I am somehow silently invested in an idea of men do this and women do that? And I think your work actually helped me come also to a resolution on that, which is that I think the reason I found it more inspiring is that, well, forgetting about gender, forgetting about sex differences, we are not going to have a world where everybody does the same thing. And so finding any instances of equality in a context where people are doing clearly different things,
yeah,
is just much more, I think, kind of more generalizable good news that we can manage this.
I mean, I think the important take home message from this is that there is no ideologically, no job is put higher than the others. Firstly, there's a few things that I wanted to point out. As you might have seen in the paper on gender egalitarianism, women are actually in a lot of societies, in a lot of hunter gatherer societies, they are participating in hunting pretty frequently. But even in the cases where they don't, and then men are the ones taking care of hunting and women are taking care of gathering, meat, although it has more calories, is also coming in much less frequently. And then the yams and the other sources of carbohydrates that women gather are the regular sources of nutrition for the group. So there is no status wise, no one source of nutrition is given higher prestige, which means the people doing that, bringing in that one source of nutrition, is also not given higher power or higher importance. And I think not having that ideologically putting one on a higher upper status as the other, that's the thing that actually helps. So everyone can be doing different things. No job is less important than the other.
And yeah, and like I said, I think it is that possibility becomes even more important if we talk about different kinds of equality, because yeah, between the genders, we can kind of assume that maybe we could have a world where everybody just does roughly similar things, whether that's desirable or not. We can imagine that, but there's no way to imagine a world where every person does the exact same thing as every other person. And so for genuine equality, I think that it's just really important to find ways to do different things and still respect each other equally.
Actually, there's an interesting, just to tie it back, the hunter-gatherer equality with the evolutionary story of gender inequality. In the Akta community itself, So this is not a paper, this is not a study that I worked with, but it's from the data is coming from the same community. So Akta people have started engaging with agriculture more and more. They are engaging with the nearby villages and they're actually being employed by the farmers surrounding their communities for agricultural work. And in those groups which have started doing more agriculture, firstly, women have also started being part of agriculture, and the leisure time for women has gone down significantly. So both men and women are losing leisure time, but the loss of leisure time for women is significantly higher. And there are more norms of gender inequality coming into play in those groups which are starting to engage with agricultural labor.
Very interesting and sad.
How agriculture is always leading to these gender unequal patterns. What is this?
Yeah, well, let's talk about that. Why? Why is agriculture associated with gender inequality?
Well, there's the plow theory of actual physically being able to participate in some activities or not. The plow itself being a machine which requires more upper body strength that has been said to allow men to work more in the fields and men to actually control the crop production because on an average they have more upper body strength.
I personally think it's a good theory as far as it goes, because there is a correlation. Interesting. There's a correlation between how suitable the soil is for the plow and how much gender inequality the societies have nowadays. I don't think it's a good story for the origins of the problem for a couple of reasons. One is you have plenty of very patriarchal societies without the plow. There were no plows in the Americas when the Europeans landed there. I'm not an expert on Native American cultures, but when Cortez arrived, it wasn't that he was meeting with female empresses, but it was that he was given 20 female slaves as a kind of gift by the Mayas, which then allowed him to find one who was a translator and was able to orchestrate the whole, coup of Tenochtitlan, which is a kind of anecdotal point, but when reading about this kind of big civilizations in the Americas, which were definitely not plow-based, it's certainly, whether they were as patriarchal as the Europeans, very questionable. Whether they were somewhat patriarchal, almost obvious to me that yes, they were.
I mean, it also depends. Maybe they were plow-based at some point and then they transitioned to another.
I don't think they could have, because they didn't have any bulls, they didn't have any horses which could have pulled the plow, other than the llama amongst the Incas, and the llama can't pull very much.
I see. I mean, yes, I started off with the plow thing, but I think I have a list of other conjectures or theories, which could also be linked with agriculture. One of the important ones that I think is with agriculture, there was the development of storage technology, which allowed you not only to produce a lot of crops, but also store the crops for, multiple seasons, even multiple years. And what that meant was you can actually hoard a lot of crops within yourself for yourself, which you can pass on generationally. And when their crop fails because there's a drought or there's too much rains, you actually have the thing that other people need, which also leads to hierarchy in general. There's also land, which became a prized possession, and that is an immovable property. So once you have immovable property, you want to make sure it sort of stays in your family, in your lineage, and that prompted the shift of males who are controlling the land and actually taking care of the land, wanting the women that they would marry to come over and settle down their households with them.
And do I understand right? What you're saying is that before you have property that you pass down, it's not that big of a deal where the family moves and whether you have sons or daughters. But when you start having the question of accumulated property and who am I going to give this in the next generation, you have to face those. Then you have a difficult bargaining task. And there, if males have any little advantage, they can start kind of forcing that, okay, let's not move to your place. Let's stay in my place.
Yeah. I mean, it's also sort of, in the beginning, you can say that it's a very practical decision because this piece of land is where the food is going to come from. And a man would prefer to, till his own land than move to the women's side of the family and till their land. I mean, I don't know. They might have, I'm sure there has been a lot of variation, and some men
Yeah, and they
still.
are matrilinear farmers.
I mean, but even in those, the men are the ones who are actually doing more agricultural labor.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
It's just that the land is passed down along the female lineage side. But just to sort of stay where we were, um, the emergence of patrilineage and patrilocality sort of went hand in hand. That's one of the reasons why we could say gender inequality sort of came about. Another correlated thing, and I think all of these things are sort of giving rise to a bigger story with all of them being correlated factors to each other. When women are moving, they're also losing their social networks.
Yeah.
And one of the biological theories of how the sexes sort of control each other is that men are, on an average, in most primate species, bigger than the females on an average. In some species, they're the same size. So men always try to. I mean, that's the general theory. Again, it's all very generalized at the moment. What I'm saying, where males try to control females to sort of control their sexuality, ensure that the child that she's bearing is his. And the way that females neutralize male dominance over them is by forming coalitions. And in hunter gatherer societies, coalition forming is a very big part of their gender equal culture, which is something that I also write about in the paper. They have these song and dance rituals in the Bayaka, for instance, where the women are all huddled together in a circle and they're singing and dancing together, talking about how the penis is going to fall off. Yes, yes, yes. There's some really nice photos and videos of Bayaka women doing that. It's sort of showing symbolically, there it's not going to lead to any fights, but it's symbolically showing that women are also powerful, especially when they come together. And one of the things that happened with the move of women away from their natal networks is they lost access to social networks, but also because they are not part of subsistence activities anymore. They're more or less staying in the house and taking care of their children. So they don't have as much access as they would if they were all going out gathering together. Because gathering is an activity which requires at least a few women to go out together.
So interesting. So the idea is that because it's not that hunter-gatherers live in a kind of Garden of Eden where there isn't any conflict, but the woman can neutralize possible male domination with coalitions. But when you strip women away from their social networks, you put them in this kind of patrilocal clan village. They don't have that option anymore. That makes a ton of sense. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think there's all of these things going on all together. The move of women away, the emergence of controlling and storage of food, land becoming a possession that you want to pass down in your family, that requiring the women to move to the male side, doing that move, stripping them of their social networks, and also the relegation of women to the domestic sphere because now you have the food to feed the children. So you want to create more and more children. And that would essentially limit women to being at home because if you're producing children every 2 years or sometimes even in less than 2 years, you're just busy being pregnant, reproducing, breastfeeding, and repeat the cycle.
Yeah, so that could be the extra. Because I was thinking like all this makes sense, but I'm still wondering why would the man be in, especially before the plow? Why would the man have anything more to contribute on the farm? There are plenty of female farmers around the world who are using hoses and even plows sometimes. And I guess what you're saying is that well, part of the problem, if I hear you right, part of the problem is that farmers tend to have a lot of kids. And there's all sorts of theories of why, but if you have a lot of kids, well, yeah, you might be using the plow when you're not pregnant. You're not going to be using it when you're pregnant.
Exactly. Yeah.
I see. Yeah. I'm inclined to think of the accumulation of property must be in some sense primary because, well, for example, we haven't talked at all about the third mode of subsistence, which is pastoralism, which is shepherds and, like Mongols and whatnot. I don't know much about the culture, the patriarchy, matriarchy during Genghis Khan or other, steppe pastoralists, but I don't get the impression that they were gender egalitarian.
I mean, yeah, from the Mongols, you don't get that impression out of.
No, you don't get that impression. Please, listeners, correct us if we're wrong. But to the extent that these kind of nomadic pastoralists who don't own land but own cattle, for example, or own sheep. My quick impression on them is that it tends to be so that even if there's no patch of land where the wife would move into, it is very often the marriage would mean that the wife would move into the moving group of the husband, not the other way around. So it's not in that case it's not the agriculture, but it's still patriarchality, patrilinearity, and accumulation of property. And somehow that does seem to be a perfect storm somehow. But I'm still wondering why don't we have more examples of property accumulating and then being passed by the woman to their daughters and the husbands moving in there? Is it just the kind of once the stakes become so high, men end up using what they are typically better at, which is violence, in getting their way? So basically, I guess what I'm asking, is the sword more important than the plow in being something that the upper body strength gives you an advantage in, and then you can get your way?
Yeah, I don't know. I actually don't know. I almost feel like there's something, because I've been reading up a lot on these matrilocal and matrilineal societies in the northeast of India.
Okay, can you tell me more about them? It's something I've heard that they exist. I don't know anything about them.
So I don't know the reasons why they're lesser numbered, but I'll just tell you what little I know about them. So there's one fact of when you move more eastward towards in India, like Bengal and further, so I'm talking about this in a very informal way. There's a general stereotype that Bengali women, and I'm a Bengali woman as well, are more dominating, and the men are more softer. And then you keep going east, and in the northeast, and this is now data that I'm talking about, anthropological data. There are these tribes called the Khasi and Garo tribes, which are highly matrilineal. The women are the ones who control the money that comes in the household. The men still work, but women are in charge of financial decisions. Women are in charge of deciding where they live or where they don't, where the family is going to live. Women actually provide a small allowance to the males every month to spend on whatever they want to spend in. Usually they spend it on booze. And there were these really funny what do you say, excerpts in this anthropology journal where a man is sort of almost crying to this anthropologist, saying that these women treat us like we are nothing. They give us like a little bit of money at the end of every month to spend on alcohol. They treat us like things around the house. They make us do the jobs. And then he was basically crying, saying all of this. And I was like, wow, this is amazing.
That's so fun.
They're crying. They're like, oh my God, they don't treat us well. They don't give us any power. They don't give us any money. They are mistreating. They're abusing us for different reasons. And yeah, the women are the ones who carry most of the decision-making power at the households.
Very interesting. Very interesting. And so I guess the really big question here is that because it is such a small minority of agricultural and pastoral societies, is that because of a kind of hard, determined reason like the ones we've been exploring? Or could it be just luck? Could it be that if we would run a simulation of world history, though, that would end up being the norm? I'm very skeptical because the numbers are so strongly in favor of patriarchy. Yeah. So I think there must be a reason. But if you would just meet someone who's only studied these are agricultural people, this Eastern, the Indian, Northeastern. These are not hunter-gatherers. That's the most important thing. They're food producers, so either by farming or pastoral food production. And then you would compare them to hunter-gatherers like the Inuit, where boys are very strongly preferred. There you will get a completely different picture than the one that we've been describing. And so it's just important to see that we're talking about the big trends, the majority of cases with a lot of simplifications, and they are these outliers. In the Inuit case, I think that my impression is that Arctic, or basically the further you go from the equator, the more important things like big mammal hunting become, because the less you have plant foods. And that tends to mean that the men contribute much, much more to the subsistence. So actually, I just published a very small bonus episode on polyandry, So one wife, many husbands around the world. And one of the examples there is that some Inuit groups practice polyandry. And the reason they give for it is that, well, if you lose the father for the child, it's a catastrophe because there's no food. And so you have to have a kind of backup dad.
The women are not able to hunt.
They are not, and that's the big question. Why do they not? Why don't they join the hunt? We don't know. We don't know. One theory is that it's because it's so dangerous, and losing the mom would be even more catastrophic. And so it's the men doing the dangerous jobs. One theory is that it requires so much strength, so it's the men doing the difficult job. I mean, well, I just don't know. I just don't know. But definitely the strong tendency amongst the Inuit seems to be the very strong preference for boys, and done from a kind of place of, well, we just can't afford to have a daughter because we need someone who can contribute food. Yeah. Which is if we just simplify hunter-gatherers being gender egalitarian and food producers, farmers, pastoralists being patriarchal, you find of course outliers to that trend. But the trend is really strong, and I think that's why I personally find it valuable to try to understand the trend, like we've been trying to do today. So thank you so much for all your thoughts on that. I mean, we could talk a little bit about fairness also, because there's you and I, as anyone listening will detect, tend to see, our instinct is to see gender equality as fair.
Yes.
But we can also take a step back and ask, does everyone? You've done really interesting work on the idea of fairness. So why don't you just start by giving a kind of quick overview? What made you interested in fairness? And what do you think the field of psychology, anthropology might have gotten wrong about fairness?
When you're studying inequalities, and if you want to understand how people are perceiving inequalities, fairness is pretty much the most natural thing that comes to mind, because we do, at least in the Western liberal philosophical tradition, equate equality with fairness and inequality with some sort of unfairness. So that's one of the reasons. Understanding perception of inequalities led me to studying fairness. In the field, there is a lot of stuff. It's ridiculous, the amount. So there's multiple theories of fairness. Some of them are very much opposed to each other, and there's ridiculous amounts of evidence on both sides. And I can tell you just like in one word, what the different theories of fairness are. And I could also tell you what's kind of my position in there. So the most obvious description of fairness is equality of some sort. And there's a lot of experimental and anecdotal and anthropological evidence saying that people find equal distribution of labor, of resources to be fair. Then there's others who came around and said, well, it's not equality per se, but it's equity. If somebody contributes more, they should get more out of the joint venture. And that is what fairness is. But then there's others who are looking at contractualist views of morality, which basically looks at moral intuitions that we have in a social contract framework. And they say that if there are certain individuals or groups who have higher outside options, or they can be better off without the current cooperation venture, they should automatically get more out of the current cooperation venture.
So this is harking back at your bargaining model of gender inequalities, is that if the men have more options outside, it's of course they're going to then have a better deal
Of course.
in the pair.
Yeah, otherwise, why would they even, cooperate with you? They can get better deals anywhere. That's one view. And the other one, there's a lot of in the anthropology of care and anthropology of ethics, they talk a lot about how human connections and human relationships matter more than these objective calculations of equity or equality. And I think that is where I stand at the moment. That's the studies that we have been doing, trying to understand so what I have seen in my life from the relationships I have is that I'm not always calculating did I pay last time? Did the other person pay last time? Like who did what? And based on that, who should do what now? And, always keeping this sort of scoreboard in your head. But once you develop relations, you sort of get rid of these scoreboards and it becomes more dependent on the kind of trust you have and more relational aspects of the interaction more than calculating what's objectively equal or unequal.
So it's not the way humans think about fairness tends not to be if X meets Y, but it is this person meeting that person and their existing relationship matters. That makes a ton of sense. But does it matter equally around the world? My guess would be that if you ask a kind of, I don't know, university educated liberal minded Westerner, they would be more the X meets Y person. And if you ask a traditional village community, they would be more that it really matters who is who and how they know each other.
Exactly. You've said exactly what the thing that we were finding. We were looking at, so we did this experiment on Prolific first, which I think I would say Prolific UK, which I think is more like, the university educated or taking a very, outsider view of things person.
That's me.
That's you.
University educated Western white dude, yes.
Yes, you are. That's true. So you would think that everything is based on calculations of who did what, and then based on that, who should get what.
Okay.
But I also came to India. I collected some data from India, from different socioeconomic groups. And again, in India as well, I went to this liberal arts university and I collected data from there. And they have a very similar sort of result pattern as the prolific workers. But then I started going and talking to people from the lower socioeconomic groups. So in India, we have housemaids who are basically the blue collar workers who are going from house to house to do various tasks, or rickshaw drivers, or auto drivers, or security guards, or toilet cleaners, just people in the gig economy, the informal.
Okay, but so this is not a village community. This is a urban, lower socioeconomic class.
Yeah, I mean, but
gig
most
work.
of them, like literally, I would say 95% of them had parents who are still living in villages and they were coming.
Okay.
And a lot of them still go back because there's some smaller villages nearby, so they sort of go back. The others have their parents living in villages. Now they've taken up some small dwellings in the city, but they have very strong roots there. They potentially, most of them grew up there. And they have a stronger view of, it works if everyone sort of knows what the other person is going to do and if everyone does their job. Which is to say that if a mother is supposed to take care of these tasks, it does not matter if the child is not paying back in labor with the exact amount. The mother is supposed to do this, let her do these things, then the child knows what to expect, or the father knows what he should be doing because the mother has done all of this. So there's a much more relational view of fairness in these lower socioeconomic, village rooted groups of people.
I mean, that does sound, so far that sounds pretty similar to the general kind of individualism versus collectivism distinction that's very common in cultural psychology. Am I right that in some of those studies, the kind of more relational collectivistic, the lower socioeconomic class in India way of thinking can actually perceive things like gender inequality as more fair than the more abstract university educated style impersonal way of seeing, because I remember reading, I think it was in one of your papers, but it might have been somewhere else, that in that kind of thinking there are many women, for example, who say that, well, of course I need to do more because that's just what women need to do. Like that's part of what it means to be in a relationship where there's a woman and a man. Is just, well, that's just what is expected of me.
Yeah, that was in the paper.
Okay, that was in your. Well, I'm really curious to hear your thoughts on that, because it's you're kind of threading in between the worlds.
Yes.
And yeah, what do you make of that?
I mean, yeah, that conflicts me very, very much.
Okay. Well, let's sit with the conflict for just a moment.
Yeah, so the conflict is that I want there to be a lot more gender equality at these sort of thinkings where there are social roles which are expected to do certain things and other social roles who are expected to do the rest of the things also naturally leads to inequalities of some sort. But I think so. But the fact is that such relational thinking does exist. And if you think outside the context of gender, I think sometimes relational thinking is good. It does not, when it comes with the ideological barrier of women should always be doing these things, even if it means a lot of inequality. So I think the way to resolve that would be the point that you made about there possibly being diversity in what people do, but everyone being accorded equal decision-making power about their lives and equal sort of respect and status in their houses and in their society. So everyone can do different things. There's a lot of benefits to having division of labor. It just makes life more efficient, more predictable, easier to cooperate. But as long as it does not mean one person or one group of people disrespecting the other group of people, I think it can still work out.
I hear you. I think that also one thing that could be taken as a lesson. I'm just thinking out loud here, but if we approach this question of what's fair not from a kind of abstract bargaining or abstract ideas of equality or bargaining or whatever, but rather from a relational care position, maybe that doesn't mean that there isn't any place to argue for more gender equality amongst people who think like that. But maybe we should just do it less from an abstract argument point of view and more from a care point of view. And I don't think there's anything caring in dominating your wife as a husband.
Yeah.
Yeah. And but maybe the argument that bites there would be more about tapping more into familial feeling of care and compassion rather than into feelings of abstract, well, it's just not fair. So what do you think of that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the only way you can argue. I mean, that's the only way I can argue about having these divisions of labor while, not also having women or men being subjugated by, the other sex, is by saying that there's a difference in inherent preferences, let's say, or individual preferences. And it's being done from a point of view of caring for the other person, for providing your share to joint relationships and joint households and communities. So I think that's
okay. Well, I think that's a good place to come to a final question. So, how has all the things we talked about today? How has all your research shaped your outlook on humanity?
I think I would actually use something that you said in order to say what's my current position as a human being. In that, I think doing anthropology makes you appreciate the diversity that human societies and human beings can have. And within having those diverse states of being, we can still find ways to be equally respectful to each other and give equal importance and love to everyone. And I think that's something that you bring it up. I think it's really inspirational and it's really optimistic. And that's where I'm at. Just understand everyone's point of view. It takes a lot of work, honestly, like even in person or like just listening to everyone in their own context with their own stories. So much work. But I think it's worth it if you want to really understand how people operate and also take everyone seriously.
Angarika, Deb, thank you so much for your research and time today.
Thank you so much. It's a really cool conversation.
Okay, so that was it for today. Now I have some exciting news that I want to share here before I let you go, which is that in February this year, I'm going to be starting a new series called The Origins of Humankind. It will be produced together with the UC San Diego-based Center for Academic Research and Training in Anthropogeny. That's CARTA for short. And we have an excellent lineup, some really top scholars telling the whole story from the origin of life all the way to the dawn of agriculture and what happens after that. So stay tuned for The Origins of Humankind on this feed. Needless to say, if you haven't done so yet, subscribe to On Humans to stay tuned. But that's it for now. Take care.